Hello, Definers. Welcome to episode 97. Today we're doing something a little bit different. Typically on this podcast, we will define a topic and then dive deeper with an industry expert. Today, it is just the two of us, and we're covering the most recent repeal of the 2009 Greenhouse Gas Endangerment Finding under Section 202A of the Clean Air Act. I'm your host, Cecilia.
And I'm your host, Nethra. And this is the first time in a while that it's just been the two of us, Cecilia. I'm kind of excited.
It might be the first time ever, Nethra, actually.
Yeah, you're right. We've always had a guest. But this is an important topic, and we are going to be covering everything starting from why this act was started, how it got approved, and the impact this act has had over the past decades in terms of regulation. We will also cover the timeline of how we got here and why it got repealed. It's important to say that this episode is purely informational, and our focus is to educate you all on what this means.
Thanks for that clarification, Nethra. And without further ado, let's get defining.
So we first mentioned earlier that this finding was signed under the Clean Air Act. Let's get started by talking about what that is and what that act did for climate action and regulation. The Clean Air Act is a comprehensive federal law that regulates air emissions from stationary and mobile sources. So stationary would be like power plants, and cars would be an example of a mobile source. This law authorized the EPA to establish the National Ambient Air Quality Standards to protect public health and welfare and regulate the emissions of hazardous air pollutants.
And there's an important distinction here, Nethra, because federal air policy didn't start with the Clean Air Act. This wasn't the first. It actually evolved in stages. The Air Pollution Control Act of 1955 was really the federal government's first step, but it was limited. It didn't regulate pollution, it mainly provided research funding, signaling that air pollution was becoming a national concern in 1955, while leaving control mostly to the local and state governments at this time. Then, in 1963, the Clean Air Act was the turning point. It was the first time the federal government created an actual real framework for addressing air pollution, and it was administered through the U.S. Public Health Service, so before the EPA. Then, the Air Quality Act of 1967 pushed it further by addressing interstate pollution transport and expanding federal authority for monitoring and research.
Right. So if you zoom out, the progress looks like this, right? 1955, the government was just understanding the problem. In 1963, they started building authority to address it in the form of the Clean Air Act. And then in 1967, they began tackling the complexity of this enforcement, especially across state lines. The Clean Air Act is no ordinary piece of legislation, Definers. It's a landmark moment in the environmental movement. It was signed into law just a few months after the first ever Earth Day in April of 1970, which is kind of crazy that it took that long for us to get a hold of this.
I know.
That's neither here nor there.
Earth's birthday is only less than 60 years?
Right, apparently. And honestly, the timing of Earth Day and this legislation was no coincidence. During this time, Congress was responding to growing public concern about pollution, smog, and environmental degradation. And the act reflected that momentum. So this is just to say, keep the power to the people, and it matters.
Mm-hmm.
The Clean Air Act of 1970 established a federal framework to regulate air pollution nationwide, well before the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, was formally operational. So around the same time, the National Environmental Policy Act was passed, which helped lay the groundwork for the EPA's creation. So the Clean Air Act came before the EPA was even in existence. And then,
crazy,
in 1977, major amendments were added to introduce permit review requirements, ensuring that states and industries complied with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or the NAAQS. Then, stay with me, Definers, in 1990, shout out to all my 90s babies out there.
Are you a 90s baby, Nethra?
I am. 1997.
Oh, I'm not. FOMO.
That's crazy. Whenever I meet people born after 2000, I'm like, this is so weird.
I'm a baby.
So weird. In 1990, further amendments expanded enforcement authority, and strengthened permit programs, and then eventually addressed new pollutants like acid rain, ozone-depleting chemicals, and toxic emissions. So when you look at it as a timeline, the Clean Air Act isn't just a law, it's a living framework that evolved with science, public demand, and environmental priorities over decades. It basically shaped how the U.S. manages air quality even today.
Quite important stuff, Nethra. And all of this, the Clean Air Act, the National Environment Policy Act, the creation of the EPA, didn't just happen just because. Public awareness and outrage were key drivers behind these policy milestones. So stay outraged, definers. And that brings us to a real catalyst of the modern environmental movement, Rachel Carson, the queen of the environmental movement, might I add.
The literal queen.
And quick fun fact here, historians largely credit her 1962 novel, Silent Spring, as the spark that ignited public concerns about chemicals in the environment. Rachel Carson was a scientist and conservationist who started her career writing official government reports for the Fish and Wildlife Service and articles for the Baltimore Sun. But it wasn't until an editor and friend at the New Yorker encouraged her to write a book that she not only changed the course of her own life, but changed the course of every American's life. I mean, talk about impact.
If you took AP Environmental Science, you definitely have heard her name. There's no way.
For real. Like apes, it was all about Rachel Carson.
Life-changing.
But her book, Silent Spring, sounded the alarm about these chemicals, especially DDT, and their harmful effects on ecosystems and public health. The book was controversial at first, as things tend to be, and it drew a lot of pushback from chemical companies, but it ultimately led to major policy changes. Carson called for bans on long-lasting pesticides, and she also called for stricter regulations for chemical use. These ideas were revolutionary at the time, and that timing mattered too. During this time, 1962, we're coming on the heels of the Vietnam War, and Americans were already grappling with the disillusioning realities of these defoliants and biological weapons used in Indochina. Carson's message resonated because people were ready to question the safety of human-made chemicals and the systems that allowed them to proliferate. Her story is inspiring. I mean, one person armed with science and determination helped mobilize more than 14,000 scientists, lawyers, and advocates across the country to fight for environmental protection. That public energy helped launch the modern environmental movement. And really, we wouldn't be talking about the Clean Air Act or the EPA without Rachel Carson. So, definers, when you think you can't make an impact on the world, just think about Rachel Carson. She was one woman.
Actually crazy and a truly inspiring story. Public awareness really drove basically all congressional action at this point and the government response here to this major issue. Rachel Carson even testified before Congress about the urgent need for a federal agency to monitor these toxic chemicals. And guess what, definers? They listened. That agency is what we now know as the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, founded in 1970, just a few months after the first ever Earth Day. But the period from 1962 to 1970 is especially important. The late 60s were a turning point for the environmental movement. As we mentioned, Rachel Carson's book had come out as a series of high-profile environmental crises transformed basically how Americans saw the environmental movement. We had Silent Spring talk about chemical pollution. Then in 1969, the Cuyahoga River in Ohio actually caught on fire because of the oil. Like, imagine seeing a river, a body of water catch on fire.
And no social media to post like, hey, this river's on fire, like that blows my mind. People didn't know about it.
Right. And the oil and the chemical pollution on the surface literally set this river on fire and engulfed it in flames. And that same year, major smog events in New York City and LA exposed the public to health risks of urban air pollution. And there was a Santa Barbara oil spill also in 1969, which dumped massive amounts of crude oil into the California coast. So you can see that there's just like thing after thing after thing.
It's
And
like they can never win here.
that disaster, all of those disasters, pushed the Nixon administration to halt new offshore drilling permits in populated areas and create protections for marine ecosystems, basically laying the foundation for future marine sanctuaries. So all of these events together, Carson's advocacy, rivers on fire, visible air pollution, and disasters left and right, caused outrage and created pressure for the federal government to act, and gave birth to the landmark legislation like the Clean Air Act and the creation of the EPA. Now, what the heck is the 2009 greenhouse gas endangerment finding, and why is it important, and how does it tie into all of this history? I know we just yapped at you guys and gave you a bunch of dates and timelines, but I promise it's for a reason.
It feels like one of those like crash course from AP Bio when you were studying for your AP exam. I don't know if you
That
guys...
actually gives me trauma.
No, right? I don't know if you guys remember those YouTube videos, but this is what this episode kind of feels like. Anyway, what a fabulous first question, Nethra. Firstly, this finding that was repealed was signed by the EPA administrator on December 7th of 2009, so nearly 17 years ago, and it was signed under the Clean Air Act, which we just yapped to you about. Two distinct findings were signed on that day. The first being the Endangerment Finding, which states that the current or projected concentrations of the 6 key well-mixed greenhouse gases, which are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, PFCs, and sulfur hexafluoride in the atmosphere, threaten the public health and welfare of current and future generations. The second finding was the cause or contribute finding, which finds that the combined emissions of these gases from new motor vehicles and engines contribute to the greenhouse gas pollution that threatens public health and welfare. So, in simpler terms, because that is a mouthful, these findings formally recognize that greenhouse gases are a danger to public health and welfare, and that human activity, specifically vehicle emissions, play a role in that risk. These were foundational for the EPA's ability to regulate these greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act.
Is that why we have emissions tests? Well, we will find out. Let's pause here and unpack why this finding was even signed, because it's actually a pretty interesting story. So here's the tea. In 2007, Massachusetts, along with 11 other states and several cities represented by James Milkey, filed a lawsuit against the EPA. They were basically saying, hey, federal agency, you need to get your shit together and regulate greenhouse gas emissions. These pollutants are changing the climate and harming the environment. So these states filed suit against the federal agency to force the EPA into regulating these emissions correctly. Well, the case ended up going all the way to Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. The court's decision was a game changer. It confirmed that greenhouse gases count as air pollutants under the Clean Air Act, which gave the EPA the authority and legal obligation to regulate them. So that 2009 endangerment finding, it wasn't pulled out of thin air. It was the result of states forcing action through the courts, and it laid the groundwork for federal GHG regulation in the United States.
Check out that checks and balances right there. I mean, cue Schoolhouse Rock. But wait, Nethra, there's even more tea in this case. Back in 1997, the U.S. Senate unanimously rejected the Kyoto Protocol, which, for context, is an international treaty under the UNFCCC that legally required developed countries to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So why'd the U.S. say, nah, we good? Well, a couple of reasons here. First, the treaty didn't require emissions reductions from heavily polluting developing countries like India and China. And second, the Bush administration argued that forcing strict cuts on the U.S. while other countries weren't held to the same standard would hurt the economy. Basically, the U.S. position was, we're happy to cut emissions, but it has to be fair across all major emitters. And that tension between environmental responsibility and economic concern is a reoccurring theme in climate policy debates here. The U.S. argued at the time that the exemption or required emission cuts from developing countries was unfair.
As if they're not outsourcing most of their manufacturing to those countries anyways.
No,
LOL.
literally. But let's fast forward down the timeline a little bit. In 1999, a group of private organizations filed a rulemaking petition asking the EPA to regulate greenhouse gases from new motor vehicles under Section 202 of the Clean Air Act. So that same section that the endangerment finding is in. And a rulemaking petition is basically a formal request submitted to a government agency asking it to create, change, or enforce a regulation. Think of it like a please make a rule for this letter, but without any actual legal backing. But the second Bush administration pushed back, clarifying that carbon dioxide wasn't considered a pollutant under the act, essentially saying, nope, we're not regulating. And then in 2005, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit upheld the EPA's decision, agreeing with the administration's position in response to that petition filed. But it doesn't end there, definers. In 2006, the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, which agreed to hear it, issuing a writ of certiorari to answer two central questions revolving this case: whether the EPA had the authority to regulate greenhouse gases, and whether states and organizations had standing to challenge the agency's decision.
And when the Supreme Court granted the writ of certiorari in 2006, what they were really saying was, we're going to hear this case and decide if the lower court got it right. Now, if you don't remember your political science class very well, a writ of certiorari is basically the Supreme Court's way of choosing which cases to review.
I had to look up what that meant, Nethra.
Yes.
I did not remember.
I did not. I don't even think I paid attention in that class, to be so real with you. Anyways, it's basically the Supreme Court's way of choosing which cases to review. They get thousands of petitions every year, but only get to pick a few that have broad legal importance, involve federal law, of course, or could set a major precedent. And in this instance, the court agreed to hear the case because it had huge implications. Could the EPA regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act? Could the states and private groups sue the EPA if it refused to act?
And here are the arguments. The petitioners argued that the decision not to cap CO2 is an abuse of discretion from the EPA, basically saying that the agency was failing to follow the Clean Air Act. And the EPA, in return, argued that CO2 is not an air pollutant covered by Section 202. Their reasoning was, number one, Congress had never passed binding emissions limits specifically aimed at combating global warming, so EPA didn't have clear direction. Number two, regulating air pollutants that contribute to climate change would have economic impact per the Supreme Court ruling in FDA v. Brown and Williams Tobacco Corp., where the court found that regulating tobacco had economic impact. And number three, finally, the EPA argued that the only reasonable way to reduce emissions from vehicles was by improving fuel economy, which was under the jurisdiction of the Department of Transportation and not the EPA.
So basically, the EPA's position was, okay, we get the concern, but we don't think that the Clean Air Act actually gives us the authority to act. And even if we did, it could have big economic consequences.
Exactly. But here's what happened. The court held that Massachusetts had standing to sue the EPA. They leaned on a precedent from a previous case, Lujan versus Defenders of Wildlife, which says that Congress can grant procedural rights that relax the normal rules for who has standing to sue. The court also emphasized that states get special consideration or special solicitude in these analyses because they have a quasi-sovereign interest, meaning that they have a legitimate stake in protecting their own territory, residents, and environment. So, in short, Massachusetts wasn't just whining. The state had a legitimate right and an interest, a legal interest, in making sure that the EPA did its job in protecting the citizen and its territory.
Basically, when the court says states have quasi-sovereign interests, it's just a fancy way of saying states have real skin in the game, and this isn't just a random complaint. They actually care about protecting what's theirs, their people, their land, their resources. So think of it like a parent stepping in because their backyard is on fire and they're
Imagine
obviously
your
allowed to get involved.
backyard being on fire, though. Like,
Right, like you better get involved. And the court also held that the Clean Air Act gives the EPA the authority to regulate greenhouse gases from vehicles, since these emissions. Oh, this is my question earlier. Yes. So this goes back to our emissions testing.
yes, here we go.
These emissions endanger public health and welfare. So in 2007, the Supreme Court ruled that greenhouse gases fit within the Act's broad definition of an air pollutant, meaning the EPA was legally obligated to take action.
And this ruling required the EPA to reconsider how greenhouse gases affect public health and welfare. In the aftermath of this 2007 case, the 2009 Endangerment Finding was signed, officially determining that 6 key greenhouse gases pose a threat to public health and welfare. Then in 2010, the EPA, with the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, finalized the first greenhouse gas standards for cars and light-duty trucks. And the story doesn't end there. In 2012, the endangerment finding was challenged by a coalition of states, including Texas and Virginia, continuing the legal and political debate over the EPA's authority in this regard.
And it's important to know that the court unanimously upheld the EPA's action in 2012. The court ruled that the EPA properly relied on scientific evidence. The Clean Air Act requires the EPA to determine whether emissions may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health or welfare. And the EPA was not required to reprove climate science from scratch. The court's decision cemented the legality of the EPA endangerment finding and further confirmed that GHG, aka greenhouse gases, are pollutants under the Clean Air Act. Because of this ruling, the EPA could move forward with climate regulations, and over time, these legal foundations became the backbone for landmark policies like the Clean Power Plan and even U.S. commitments under the Paris Agreement.
All right, definers, we've covered a lot of ground here with all these court cases, petitions, and rulings. And it's easy to get lost in the details. There's a lot of big words
I'm
here.
proud of you guys for sticking around.
No, for real.
So now that we know the context of why this finding was signed, let's learn about why it has been repealed. This is what you guys have been waiting to understand. Firstly, it's important to remember that the EPA denied 10 petitions received from 2009 to 2010 to reconsider the findings regarding the vehicle tailpipe rule, which was the limits of the CO2 emitted from tailpipes of new passenger cars and light-duty trucks. This is important because the tailpipe rule was the first federal climate regulation in U.S. history.
Whoop, whoop. But the story doesn't end there. Petitioners argued that the EPA relied on flawed climate science and failed to consider the economic consequences. In response, the EPA denied all those reconsiderations, making it clear that the science was solid and that under the Clean Air Act, economic concerns cannot override scientific determinations when it comes to protecting the environment.
Then, during the first Trump term, the EPA began to reconsider several Obama-era climate regulations, such as the Clean Power Plan, vehicle greenhouse gas standards, and the endangerment finding itself. Petitions were filed to repeal or reconsider the 2009 finding, but the EPA did not formally repeal it. Rather, the EPA instead proposed changing the Clean Power Plan with the Affordable Clean Energy Rule and reopen vehicle standards for reconsideration.
Right. The important distinction here being that the EPA did not revoke the endangerment finding. So the repeal in 2025 is a big deal because it has been challenged and defended by the Supreme Court and it stood. So what exactly happened? Well, let's walk through it. In 2022, the state of West Virginia, joined by other states like Texas and other coal companies, sued the EPA. They challenged the EPA's authority to implement the Clean Power Plan, which is one of those Obama-era climate regulations.
And just to quickly cut in here, Cecilia, and explain what the Clean Power Plan was about so we can provide a bit more context to the definers. It was an Obama-era rule regulating carbon emissions from existing power plants under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act. It stems from the same legal foundation as the tailpipe rule that we talked about, but it worked differently. Instead of requiring individual power plants to install specific pollution controls or operate more efficiently, the Clean Power Plan set state-level emission targets and gave states flexibility in how to meet them. That often meant shifting electricity generation away from the coal and towards natural gas, wind, and solar. So it wasn't just about cleaning up individual plants, it was about changing how the power sector generated electricity. And this was precisely West Virginia's argument that the EPA had exceeded its authority under Section 111, and Congress did not clearly authorize the EPA to restructure the nation's electricity system.
Exactly. West Virginia's claim was that Congress never clearly authorized the EPA to effectively restructure the nation's electricity system. In West Virginia's view here, the agency wasn't just regulating pollution, it was making major energy policy decisions that should have been left to Congress.
Right. So, in summary, real quick, the legal fight wasn't just about climate policy. It was about how far federal agencies can go when Congress hasn't spoken explicitly, and who ultimately gets to decide the pace and direction of the energy transition.
Everything here is kind of a language battle. They're kind of like going in between the lines and fighting out to see who has authority to regulate things. And here's the wild part, Nethra. The Clean Power Plan never even took effect. It was issued in 2015, and then in 2016, the Supreme Court issued a stay, which means that states and power companies didn't have to comply while the legal challenges were, playing out. So the rule was basically paused before it even got off the ground. Then in 2017, the Trump administration moved to repeal the Clean Power Plan and replaced it with the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, which was then finalized later on in 2019. But here is what is remarkable. Even though the Clean Power Plan was never actually implemented, states like West Virginia continued arguing that the EPA had overstepped its authority. And in 2022, the Supreme Court agreed in a 6-3 decision.
The court relied on something called the major questions doctrine. And what that means in simple terms is if a federal agency claims the power to make decisions of vast economic and political significance, Congress must have clearly authorized that power.
In other words, the court said the EPA cannot assume it has the authority to reshape the nation's electricity system unless Congress explicitly says so. So this is all pretty much a battle of who has the power to do what based on who says what.
Wow. And this is really important here because what the court did not do was overturn Massachusetts versus the EPA, aka invalidate the 2009 finding.
And that's huge, Nethra, because Massachusetts versus EPA is the case where the Supreme Court held that the greenhouse gases qualify as air pollutants under the Clean Air Act, paving the way for the endangerment finding. And if the EPA determines that they endanger public health or welfare, the agency has the duty to regulate these 6 greenhouse gases. So after West Virginia versus EPA in 2022, the EPA still technically has the authority to regulate greenhouse gases. The endangerment finding is still standing at this point.
So basically, the reason why we're giving you this really lengthy history definers is to show you that time after time, the court basically upheld that 2009 finding. So we haven't seen them repeal it yet.
Right, and that's what's important, Nethra, because the court is standing by this decision to say, yes, these are air pollutants that impact our public health and welfare, and we are giving the EPA the authority to regulate them.
Exactly. The court's decision in 2022 was narrower than overturning the endangerment finding, but it was still incredibly powerful. In West Virginia versus EPA, the court basically said this: if an agency wants to make a decision that has huge economic and political consequences, like transforming how an entire electricity sector operates, Congress has to be crystal clear that it gave the agency that authority.
And that is what is known as the major questions doctrine, which Nethra brought up a little earlier. The idea here is that agencies cannot point to broad or ambiguous language in an old statute and use it to justify sweeping national policy changes. Congress has to speak clearly.
So the EPA here didn't lose its authority to regulate greenhouse gases, but the boundaries around that authority got much tighter. And that shift in how the court views agency power sets up what happens next. Because in 2024, the Supreme Court decided another major administrative law case, Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo. And that decision fundamentally changed how courts interpret agency authority, which becomes incredibly important when we talk about the future of the endangerment finding.
So true, because that is all about authority, as we've said. So in Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo, a New Jersey fishing company, Loper Bright, sued the Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo. The dispute here was over a rule issued by the National Marine Fisheries Service that required certain commercial fishing vessels to pay for at-sea monitors. So the fishermen argued that the statute governing fisheries didn't authorize the agency to require them to cover those costs. But here's why this case matters. In deciding the case, the Supreme Court overruled what's known as the Chevron doctrine. Under Chevron, if a federal law was ambiguous, courts would defer to a federal agency's reasonable interpretation of that law. After Loper Bright, that deference is gone.
So now, without that deference, when a statute is unclear, courts don't automatically defer to the agency's expertise. Judges interpret the laws themselves, and that's basically a massive shift because it weakens agencies' abilities to rely on broad or ambiguous statutory language to defend their regulatory authority. So when we're talking about the endangerment finding, we're no longer in a world where courts automatically give the EPA the benefit of the doubt.
This matters because for decades under Chevron, if the Clean Air Act was too ambiguous, the courts would generally defer to the EPA's reasonable interpretation, especially on very complex scientific or technical questions. Like, for example, a while back, we said that the courts upheld one of the EPA's decision and said that the EPA didn't have to reprove their science. You know, they're basically saying, oh no, we trust the EPA science for that decision. So this Chevron doctrine gave agencies breathing room to implement regulations in areas where Congress hadn't spelled out every single detail. After Loper Bright, that deference is gone, so if the scope of the EPA's authority is challenged, judges will no longer ask, is this a reasonable interpretation? Instead, they will ask, what is the best interpretation of this statute? And then they decide for themselves, you know? I mean, they didn't study climate science. How are they going to know?
Yeah, it's a pretty big shift. And because the endangerment finding sits at the intersection of science, statutory interpretation, and agency authority. And if courts are less willing to defer to agency expertise, then the legal foundation supporting climate regulation becomes more vulnerable. So the fight over endangerment finding isn't just about climate science anymore. It's about who gets to interpret the law, agencies with subject matter expertise, or federal courts.
And that changes everything. This directly impacts the EPA because the agency often relied on that Chevron doctrine when interpreting broadly worded statutes like the Clean Air Act. So without this judicial deference, it becomes much easier for challengers to argue that the EPA lacks the authority to regulate greenhouse gases, which is the endangerment finding, unless Congress were to explicitly spell it out. So West Virginia and Loper Bright, these court cases do not eliminate the EPA's authority, but they narrow it and make it smaller and subject it to much stricter judicial scrutiny. That means when the EPA defends sweeping climate rules or even tries to defend the legal foundation of this endangerment finding, the courts are now likely to examine those interpretations much more aggressively.
And here's the key distinction. Before Loper Bright, the EPA could say, hey, even if the statute is ambiguous, we're the experts, so our reasonable interpretation should stand.
They're like, listen to me.
Yeah, it's like no questions asked. After Loper Bright, that argument doesn't work anymore. Courts no longer defer automatically. Judges now interpret the statute themselves. So the decision didn't strip the EPA of its authority, but it absolutely makes it easier to challenge how the agency interprets that authority.
So, when you zoom out, what we're seeing is the Supreme Court that has steadily narrowed how much flexibility federal agencies have when interpreting their authority. So this now brings us to 2025. In 2025, the EPA proposed to reconsider the 2009 endangerment finding, and what is striking here is why they chose to reconsider. This reconsideration wasn't framed around new climate science or outdated science. It wasn't based on new evidence about greenhouse gases or their impact. Instead, the agency grounded its rationale in legal arguments rather than scientific evidence. The agency questioned whether it had the authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases as it did before. The reconsideration referenced these new judicial doctrines, such as the major questions from West Virginia and the elimination of the Chevron in Loper Bright.
In other words, the agency wasn't saying the science has changed, it was saying the legal landscape has changed. And so that brings us to where we are now. In February 2026, February 12th to be exact, the EPA issued a final rule formally rescinding the 2009 endangerment finding. Huge news. And here's what's crucial. The agency did not announce a new scientific conclusion that greenhouse gases are harmless. It did not claim that the underlying climate science was wrong. Instead, the rule stated that the EPA now believes that Section 202 of the Clean Air Act does not give it authority to regulate greenhouse gases from vehicles for climate purposes. So the reversal wasn't framed as scientific correction, it was framed as a legal reinterpretation.
The EPA essentially said, even if greenhouse gases contribute to climate change, we no longer believe Congress authorized us under the statute to regulate them in the way we previously regulated them.
Exactly. It's important to remember this point, and I'll say it again. The EPA did not make a new scientific determination that greenhouse gases are harmless. It now simply lacks legal authority under the statute to regulate them in the way that it had before.
So what exactly does the repeal do? Well, first, it removes the scientific and legal foundation that supported federal regulation of greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, including vehicle greenhouse gas emission standards that were based on that 2009 finding. What it does not do is eliminate all greenhouse gas regulation in the U.S. States still retain that authority to regulate emissions, and Congress could always enact new legislation. But at the federal level, this represents a major deregulatory shift. By rescinding the endangerment finding, the EPA effectively eliminates the basis for subsequent federal greenhouse gas emission standards for motor vehicles and engines that relied on that determination. The Trump administration has framed this action as restoring consumer choice and making vehicles more affordable for American families, while also reducing broader costs tied to vehicle production and transportation.
Supporters argue that easing federal emission standards lowers compliance costs for manufacturers, which could translate into lower prices. Big if. Critics question whether those savings would meaningfully reach consumers in the first place and point to the potential obvious climate impacts and health impacts of that. So the debate now isn't just about climate science, it's about statutory authority, economic trade-offs, and how regulatory costs and benefits are distributed.
Right, and the Trump EPA has argued that prior administrations effectively created these electric vehicle mandates through aggressive emission standards and encouraged technologies, including features like automatic start-stop systems that describe as unpopular with consumers. Now, speaking from personal experience, I would drive a Prius, and that was a $25 tank to fill up. I mean,
Wow.
consumer preferences may vary, Mr. Trump.
Right. And the EPA's accompanying fact sheet also states that the endangerment finding was, in their view, a more political move used by prior administrations to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from motor vehicles and unlawfully expand federal authority. So the agency is framing this repeal not simply as a political change, but as a legal correction, arguing that it is restoring the proper limits of executive power under the statute. And the fact sheet emphasizes that the Trump EPA is committed to following the law exactly as written.
We will let the courts weigh in on how that commitment to the law plays out, right? But the framing of Trump's EPA is committed to following the law exactly as written is important because the agency is positioning this repeal as a legal correction, not a scientific one. And at the same time, the EPA acknowledges that it does not attempt to monetize the value of changes in greenhouse gas emissions resulting from the proposed action. In other words, it is not incorporating the social cost of carbon into its analysis. And that's where the economic conversation gets more complicated because climate-related costs are not theoretical. In 2023 alone, the U.S. experienced 23 separate weather and climate disasters that each resulted in more than $1 billion in damages each. And analysis, for example, of LA wildfires estimate potential losses ranging from $95 billion to over $160 billion. So when we talk about affordability and regulatory costs, it raises the broader question of how are we accounting for the economic cost of climate-related damage, and who ultimately absorbs these costs?
And that's not the full economic picture. In 2024, the EPA's regulatory impact analysis estimated that strengthened vehicle greenhouse gas standards could reduce roughly 8 billion tons of emissions over the next 3 decades, a figure the agency noted is significant relative to total U.S. annual emissions. The agency also projected substantial public health benefits, which makes sense, right? Less emissions, better health. According to the 2024 analysis, reducing greenhouse gas emissions and the co-pollutants that come with them could lead to fewer heart attacks, respiratory illnesses, and asthma cases. The EPA estimated these avoided health impacts could translate into approximately $13 billion per year in healthcare savings between 2026 and 2055. In addition, the EPA projected that although cleaner vehicles may carry higher upfront costs, drivers of new vehicles save money over time through reduced fuel expenditures, estimating average lifetime savings of around $6,000 per vehicle under the 2024 standards. However, the Trump EPA has challenged these projections, arguing that prior analysis overstated benefits and imposed compliant costs that, in their view, distorted vehicle markets and increased prices for consumers.
And this is where we come to encourage you, definers, to do your own research. Read the rule, read the court decisions, look at the data, and form your own conclusions. Right now, debates around scientific integrity and agency expertise are front and center, especially around this court case. Some argue that science is being sidelined or politicized. Others argue that greater scrutiny and transparency are necessary to ensure accountability in science. The Trump administration has called for what it describes as, quote, gold standard science, which emphasizes data accessibility, transparency, and reproducibility in regulatory decision making. Supporters view that strengthening scientific rigor in government. Critics, however, raise concerns that redefining how science is evaluated could open the door to political influence over technical or expert determinations. So ultimately, this moment isn't just about climate regulation, it is about how science, law, and politics intersect and who gets to define the standards that govern public policy.
So while the administration has framed this repeal as legal correction grounded in recent Supreme Court doctrine, the story doesn't end there. Because almost immediately after the February 2026 repeal that just happened, multiple lawsuits have been filed in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. A broad coalition of environmental, public health, and scientific organizations, including groups like the American Public Health Association, the Sierra Club, the Natural Resource Defense Council, and the American Lung Association, have challenged the rule. So people are fighting back, and organizations are getting worried about this rule. They argue that the repeal is unlawful under the Clean Air Act and the Administrative Procedure Act. Specifically, they claim the EPA cannot simply reverse the endangerment finding without adequately addressing decades of scientific evidence and established legal precedent.
And what happens next is up to the DC Circuit Courts, who will review the challenge and decide whether the EPA's repeal was lawful or not. However, decisions by the circuit courts do tend to be appealed to Supreme Courts, so this legal fight could continue for years.
Well, my gosh, I hope it doesn't drag on too long, Cecilia, but now that we've covered the history and the context leading up to last month, let's take a quick flash round on what the endangerment finding has accomplished before we wrap up.
Absolutely. The 2009 finding has been one of the most important legal and scientific foundations for U.S. climate policy over the past 16, 17 years. In short, it has established the legal basis for regulating greenhouse gas emissions under federal law, and it's led to the vehicle emission standards that reduce carbon pollution while saving consumers money.
It's also supported broader climate and environmental policies, including regulations targeting power plants, methane leaks, and industrial emissions, and measurable public health benefits like fewer asthma attacks and premature deaths under associated climate action plans.
So, as we wrap up here, definers, here's the big picture. The endangerment finding isn't just a historical footnote. It is a cornerstone of U.S. climate policy built on decades of scientific research and legal precedent. Its repeal in 2026 isn't about changing the science. Greenhouse gases still very much drive climate change, but it's actually about how federal agencies can interpret and act under federal law. That's why these court challenges matter so much. The DC Circuit and potentially the Supreme Court will shape this rule and the broader question of how far agencies can go in protecting public health and the environment.
This episode shows that climate policy isn't only about technology or emissions. It's also about law, governance, and how we define the role of expert agencies. What counts as authority? Who determines the science? And who decides when those two meet? It's a reminder that understanding climate policy means following the law as closely as you follow the science. And right now, the story is clearly still being written.
So, what can we do as citizens here? If you're interested in taking action, there are organizations working to defend the endangerment finding and protect public health and environment. Groups like Natural Resource Defense Council and the Sierra Club. You can support these organizations by going to the webpage and donating to their cause. And it's just one way of staying engaged and helping to ensure that science continues to inform climate policy in the future.
So, definers, we encourage you to read the rules, explore the data, and track the lawsuits. The outcome will affect climate, public health, and the way agencies operate for decades to come.
And remember, whether you're a Prius fan like me or just trying to make sense of the legal and scientific landscape, it all matters. Science, law, and policy collide here, and it's worth paying attention to. And it's kind of fun sometimes to learn the tea, right? I mean, I'm your host, Cecilia.
And I'm your host, Nethra, and we'll see you next time on Sustainability Defined.